I want to thank you for being here this afternoon. As you're aware, on October 2nd of 2020, we had a shooting incident here in Riley County that involved the Riley County Police Department. That matter was investigated by the Lawrence Police Department. We had an outside agency that came in and completed the investigation, and that investigation was turned over to me on November 11th of 2020. The person that was shot on October 2nd, 2020, did die from his injuries on October 3rd, 2020. The law in the state of Kansas reads, a person is justified in the use of force against another when and to the extent it appears that such person reasonably believes that such force is necessary to defend such person or a third person against such other's imminent use of unlawful force. B, a person is justified in the use of deadly force under circumstances described in subsection A if such person reasonably believes that such use of force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to such person or a third person. This law applies not only to law enforcement but to civilians as well. It is use of force. The question before the Riley County Attorney's Office was the use of force on October 2nd, 2020 justified and reasonable given the circumstances. I want to give you some background. At approximately 8 o'clock, 7:58 on October 1st, 2020, the Riley County Police Department dispatch received a 911 call from an individual who appeared to be desperate on the phone. He made comments such as he's flipping out, he's gone nuts, and he shot at me. After obtaining necessary information and in fact getting call from a neighbor, officers responded to 4604 Freeman Road, Manhattan, Riley County, Kansas. Although Freeman Road address is Manhattan, Kansas, that location is actually about 7 miles north of Manhattan, up by Tuttle Creek Reservoir, off Tuttle Cove Road. Numerous officers from the Riley County Police Department responded to this call. Initially, based on the information that they were given, both in the initial call to dispatch and the initial statements that were made when they arrived, they believed they were responding to possibly either an aggravated assault or an attempted homicide. Later in the evening, it was determined that that was not the case. The witness who had provided that statement earlier, it's kind of understandable. People under nervous excitement sometimes make statements that are exaggerated, but informed law enforcement officers that Jared Kemp did not actually shoot at him, but had fired a round off in the house. In fact, 2 rounds that went through the ceiling. In addition to the Riley County Police Department, the Fort Riley civilian chief of police arrived, as well as a sergeant, a captain, and a lieutenant colonel. At some point in the evening, commanding general from Fort Riley also arrived. Once the Riley County Police Department, cooperating and working in conjunction with chain of command, Jared Kemp's chain of command at Fort Riley, as well as the chief of police, determined this was not a crime, efforts were made to try to resolve this matter peacefully, to avoid a confrontation. The efforts at that time became to try to get Jared Kemp help. Background on Jared Kemp. Jared Kemp was a 21-year veteran of the United States Army. He was set to retire shortly after October 1st, 2020. He was just waiting on documents to go through so that he could retire and go on about his life. Jared Kemp, however, had also been in combat. In fact, he spent almost 5 years of his 21 years in combat. He was deployed to Iraq on 3 occasions, and to Afghanistan on his last deployment, and he saw combat in each of those deployments. Officers of the Riley County Police Department, along with personnel from Fort Riley, friends and family, pleaded with Jared Kemp to come out, to put down the gun, and to get help. In the course of the evening, 2 captains from the Riley County Police Department determined that there was no crime. No crime had been committed. And the Riley County Police Department was going to back out in hopes that to de-escalate, to avoid any type of risk of a confrontation, and to hope that this, by leaving the area, this would avoid any type of confrontation with any degree of force being used. As officers began to leave the Freeman Road area, another shot was fired by Jared Kemp. This would have been between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning on October 2nd of 2020. Law enforcement officers immediately returned. They tried to contact Mr. Kemp, but were unable to make immediate contact. However, after about 5 minutes, they were able to have phone contact, and it was determined that Mr. Kemp had not taken his life. Throughout the course of the evening, Mr. Kemp had made a number of statements that he was going to take his own life. A former combat soldier, friend of his, was on the phone with him and stated that numerous times, 50 to 60 times he estimated throughout the evening, Jared Kemp had indicated he wanted to end his life. After officers had contact with Mr. Kemp and determined that he was still alive, they went back to the original plan that everybody would leave in hopes of de-escalating this matter and doing everything in their power to avoid any type of engagement. At the request of Fort Riley personnel, 1 captain remained on the scene, just to be a liaison if necessary. But the idea was that at some point, Mr. Kemp will calm down. They will be able to take Mr. Kemp, get him the necessary help that he needed. It was obvious to everyone that he was in crisis. Officers left the area except for the 1 captain, and things remained fairly calm for approximately 40 to 45 minutes. At some point after 1:20 a.m. in the morning of October 2nd, 2020, yelling was heard coming from the residence as the captain that was still at the scene, personnel from Fort Riley, got out of their vehicles. Mr. Kemp was observed at the end of the driveway or in the roadway with a shotgun in his hand. Shortly after Mr. Kemp had entered the edge of the driveway, the roadway, his father came out of the residence and stood between law enforcement and Mr. Kemp. There were a verbal exchange between Jared Kemp and his father, while his father tried to get Mr. Kemp to put down the gun or to hand the gun over to him. Jared Kemp would not hand the gun over to his father. He struck his father, knocking his father to the ground. After being knocked to the ground, his father tried to get up. At this time, there are 7 eyewitnesses to what occurred over the next few minutes. Jared Kemp kicked his father. Depending on where the witnesses were located and the angle, some believed it was in the ribs, some believed it was in the head. All the witnesses described it, however, as a stomping motion, as opposed to a getting away, but as a stomping, and they believed Mr. Kemp possibly was trying to inflict bodily harm on his father at that time. The kicks were described in such a manner that it would have been reasonable for an officer or a person to believe that great bodily harm or death could have been inflicted with the blows. Officer 3, who had positioned himself with a rifle, watched this. With anguish, he watched the kicks being delivered to an unarmed man on the ground by his son, who was also armed with a shotgun. He did not take action at that time. He withheld fire. Some witnesses described that there was they described as a butt stroke, where Mr. Kemp took the butt of the shotgun and struck his father in the head with the butt of that shotgun. Jared Kemp then repositioned the shotgun and pointed it at his father's head. There are witnesses who said that it was the distance of, that Mr. Kemp was, distance was 5 feet between Mr. Kemp and his father. The muzzle of the gun was described as being within 1 foot to 2 foot from the head of his father. the officer pulled the trigger to end the attack and the threat to the life of the person who was on the ground. He was questioned by detectives from the Lawrence Police Department and stated he believed at the time he pulled the trigger that Mr. Kemp was going to shoot his father. Six other witnesses generally described the same feeling. One witness thought it was already too late, that even if the bullet were to strike Mr. Kemp, that he wouldn't be able to prevent Mr. Kemp from pulling the trigger and killing his father. I have reviewed the investigation that was conducted by the Lawrence Police Department. It was a very thorough investigation. I have also reviewed body-worn camera footage and body-worn camera interviews that corroborate the statements made by Officer 3, the three other officers from the Riley County Police Department, and the personnel from the United States Army. That included a captain, a lieutenant colonel, and the Fort Riley Chief of Police. Based on the evidence before me, I have no doubt that Officer 3 had reason to believe that Jared Kemp's father was in imminent danger of death. To say this is a tragedy, can't begin to describe what occurred. Mr. Kemp was a husband and a father. But what has been a common expression throughout this investigation by those who were present on the scene was that the Riley County Police Department did everything they could to avoid using any type of force, much less lethal force. So I have ruled that two officers that fired shots and only one shot struck Mr. Kemp were justified on October 2nd of 2020. What I want to point out, I guess my last concluding remarks, I have to look at this case just by itself. But we can't live in a vacuum. And I don't live in a vacuum. And I know some of the narratives nationally. But we need to be grateful that there's people that are willing to go out there and make tough decisions. You know, there were six other people there, officers, military personnel. In this scenario, an officer doesn't have the opportunity before making a split-second decision to talk to other people and say, hey, you see the same thing I'm seeing? Do you think he's about to pull the trigger? Do you think he's about to kill that other person? They have to make split-second decisions. Hesitation in this circumstance, or any further hesitation in this circumstance, and somebody else is deceased. This is a tough career. To have to make these type of decisions. Officers don't want to be put in this position. They want to help people. They want to get Mr. Kemp help. That was their goal. They would have considered it a successful night had they been able to get Mr. Kemp in a vehicle onto Fort Riley where he could have gotten the mental health treatment that he needed. And to that end, they did everything that they could, along with personnel from Fort Riley, to make that happen. I have nothing further, and I'll stand for any questions if you would have any.